Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. And today I'm joined by a very special guest. My guest is Ethan Gilsdorf, who has written a fascinating book about the cultures that have grown up around fantasy called Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks. So hello, Ethan, how are you?
I'm well. How are you? Thank you for having me, Julia.
Very good, thank you. There's so much to talk about coming out of your book and your subsequent career, but perhaps the first thing we should do is just give a little bit of background about yourself and how you fell into fantasy as a young boy, where you started your first connections to the whole subcultures that has generated.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I'm a middle-aged guy in my 50s, so the origins of this for me go back to the 1970s, and that was a time, at least in America. I can't speak to the experience in other countries, but in America, where a lot of this stuff was coming out of the shadows a little bit in terms of interest in fantasy and science fiction. You know, two big events in my world in 1977 were the release of the movie Star Wars and the adaptation of The Hobbit on television in America, anyway, by the famous Rankin Bass cartoon version of The Hobbit, and those both came out the same year. And I think I was really completely moved by them. I was very much of a sort of a dreamer and a fantasy-oriented kid in some ways. I did a lot of reading as a kid, was into art, and fantasy sort of took. I wouldn't say it was something that I had really understood as much about in terms of like it being a genre, but we were a big family of readers, and ultimately, I think around the same time or shortly about a year after having seen those movies and TV shows, I was introduced to the game Dungeons and Dragons, which in 1978 or 79, which is a while ago, was only in its infancy, but it was spreading word of mouth across America, and that was really how I got hooked, and that was maybe in some ways a gateway drug to other things. Once you learn about Tolkien and you learn about Dungeons and Dragons, you're reading science fiction. At least I was. Other fantasy authors sort of, come into play. But yeah, it's a very different era. I mean, there was also video games happening at the same time, but those were also in their infancy. So all of these interesting cultural forces were beginning to percolate. And I was not in a big city. I was in a small town in New Hampshire, which is about an hour north of Boston. So it's kind of the hinterlands. It wasn't a particularly interesting place to be in terms of, intersecting with any of this stuff. It just kind of percolated through word of mouth, mail order, things like that. There was obviously no internet or anything like that at the time. So it was kind of remarkable that this stuff kind of made its way to me in my little town, in 1978, 79.
Yeah, so I'm actually pretty much your exact contemporary. Yeah, so I think judging by what
I'm 55, if that helps.
I'm 52, so just a few years.
There we go. Yeah.
And I remember hearing rumors of this game, Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't think that I knew anyone who played it, and I got a sense it was more of a boys' club at that time. So no one invited me along, and I think I would have really enjoyed it from the descriptions in your book. Would you like to, just for those few in the world who have no idea what Dungeons and Dragons is, could you just describe what kind of technology it uses for a start? Because I think that's fascinating.
Sure. It's funny you say that, technology, because it is really one of the most rudimentary non-technological games. But because I think of the modern understanding of sort of fantasy and video games, I think we assume that Dungeons and Dragons, is sort of a video game. But ultimately, it really was just had its origins as a tabletop tabletop war game, really a miniature game, little miniatures, which traditionally were used for sort of battle reenactment style gaming. And some folks decided to, honestly, they were people who were reading Tolkien and they were reading other fantasy authors, and they thought that there might be a way to sort of blend this idea of a strategic game with a narrative experience that would maybe resemble reading Lord of the Rings. That's a good sort of example I always use to try to describe it. You imagine you're reading Lord of the Rings, but at various times you're making decisions about what the characters are doing. So in the game Dungeons and Dragons, the traditional version, which you're absolutely right, fairly and unfairly, I think has gained the sort of reputation as being a boys' club. We'll talk about this more later, I'm sure, but now it's much more inclusive.
Yeah.
But back in the day, there weren't that many, girls or women playing, but it definitely appeals to sort of the nerdy person who loves rules, because part of the game is sort of codifying a lot of rules about what might happen in a fantasy world, but also the sort of actor, storyteller, writer, type who wants to tell a story. So the game basically is you sit around with your friends, and one person who's sort of the referee, who's sort of the narrator of the story and introduces scenarios, plot hooks, if you will, and then the characters who have chosen sort of archetypal characters that really do come out of sort of Lord of the Rings and other kinds of fantasy, and The Hobbit and other kinds of fantasy tropes. There's a wizard, there's warriors, there's thieves, sort of Gandalf and Bilbo, and they're there in some ways in the sort of DNA of the game. And each person around the table plays one of these characters, and you sort of respond to what the dungeon master, who's the referee, tells you is happening, and you describe as a group what you want to do, and then you get to roll dice. I have a version of the largest version of the die.
Wow.
Like, this is a sort of model version, but this is the sort of iconic 20-sided die, which was this sort of innovation. Most dice are 6-sided, the ones you would use to play whatever board game you grew up playing with. So the idea is you'd have these charts and tables that you would consult, and given at a certain juncture in the story, you would say, I would like to do X or Y. I'd like to try to stab the spider. And the dungeon master will say, well, roll your 20-sided die, add some numbers to it, and tell me what you get. And so there's a sort of rule mechanic to it that is sort of has its roots in like really sort of arcane, complicated wargaming. But then the other side of it is this very open-ended storytelling game where things kind of happen and unfold in real time, and no one wins or loses. You just sort of you live on to the next adventure. I mean, it's really more of like episodic things that happen in the game that were you to record it, you might actually have the basis of like some kind of script or story that would resemble more of a novel really than a game, if that makes any sense.
So we're always looking for connections to sort of creativity in the sort of writing sense here. And what fascinating what you're describing is it sounds like very similar to a kind of plotting exercise you would do as part of a creative writing exercise with a class. In fact, we did something like this last night.
Yeah.
And those die remind me of, have you seen story cubes? You can get them in sets.
Yes.
Very similar. I mean, they don't use numbers, but they tend to use like little images, and you use them to sort of set up a plot. You give people sort of 6 random things, a skull, a sword, and off you go and tell the story. And I think that this idea of adding in the random chance element of the dice really unlocks creativity, because you may have plotted that you were totally going to smash that spider, and then what's a low score for a Dungeons and Dragon roll? Does it correspond to low numbers?
Basically the higher the number, the more successful or the better you are at doing something. The lower the number, the sort of more likely that you will have failed.
So I love the idea that you might be this really buff warrior, and you go in with your sword high and you get a 2. And exactly. You're completely smashed.
And conversely, if you're this is where I love because I'm such a Tolkien nerd. I love the parallels between Tolkien did such a good job of choosing for his heroes sort of everyday people, the everyman, the everywoman, Frodo, Bilbo, sort of not heroic seeming characters. Other characters in the books, absolutely, he-men and he-women, and like real sort of intentionally powerful, capable people. But both those characters are kind of reluctant and bumbling in their own way, and they have to sort of find their way to their heroics. And I think the game is Dungeons and Dragons models that a little bit, partly because if you roll this dice and you get a die and you get a 20, you always succeed. So you could be literally like shooting that arrow into the one spot in the dragon's armor that's the weak spot, and you can have success. At the same time, if you roll a 1, you trip over your sword and fall down the stairs, and bang your head or whatever. So there's always this element of chance, which does, I think, that's what makes the game exciting. It isn't just sort of anything can happen. You don't just sort of tell the story. Although certain people do play role-playing games that are really almost purely story-based, where there's very little consulting of dice or rules per se, and others which are much more fealty to the rules and really get as a teenager, when I played this game, I think we spent a lot of time arguing about the books, the rule books, about sort of interpreting rules. That was very important to a 15-year-old boy, in 1983 or whatever. Those were important, like having those battles with your friends about like how to interpret this world, interpret these turf battles over knowledge, basically.
And I suppose the other thing which strikes me, looking at it from an outsider's point of view, is the idea of you're sitting almost sharing a shared, vision of the fantasy world. Everybody will have a slightly different version of what that is in their imagination, but you're all going on this journey together and conjuring up in your own minds. And that's, I think, quite extraordinary. And then having it held over from week to week, so this carries on as a little secret world you're sharing.
Exactly. And I think that was the appeal of it as a kid, was that this was something that no one really understood, and it was sort of secretive. And as you said, we each, surprisingly, I don't remember talking amongst my friends about like, what did you picture in your head? It just was an experience that we shared. But I think when people hear about D&D, the sort of brand named abbreviation or acronym for the game, I think they think about it, well, there must be some visual representation of it. There must be a board, or and there are maps and things like that, but they're really just sort of helping to sort of orient yourself in space so you can sort of see where you are, where your characters might be. You can have little miniature figurines if you want to, but really you don't need any of that. And you certainly don't need screens. You don't need your iPad. You don't need, a digital version of it, although there are digital versions of this game. But to me, those are, to my mind, aren't as, effective. I'm interested in what's happening up here. As you said, we're all playing together. We all have our different versions in our imaginations. Just like when you read a book, you have a different version in your head of what the characters look like, or what the world looks like, or what the scene is like. And that part I love.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your book, and you've mentioned already today, that you're a Tolkien nerd.
Yes.
And in your book, you say that you came to Tolkien and had what I would came to Oxford, sort of on your search to revisit after some time of being away from this world, to go back and find the roots of what inspired you as a youngster. And you had a bit of a disappointing time, which I'm really sorry about, because there's so much potential here to actually find the sources of Middle Earth. That's partly why I'm doing this centre here, because I felt we lacked any kind of expression of that. It's a funny place. Anyway, so Tolkien for you has been there from the beginning. Is it something, or a novel series that you return to now, or do you feel you know it so well that you don't need to?
Oh, I do return to it. I mean, I think I would say I'm a huge fan. I'm not sure that I am quite like an expert super fan, in the sense that I don't know every corner of the world, and there are some of his works that I haven't read or haven't dug into entirely. But the core books for me, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, those are ones that I've read many times. I've obviously seen the movies many times. Very interested in. Have been always interested in, because I was interested in filmmaking at a certain point in my life as well, which is also part of this story. Is like at the same time that I was watching Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, I was trying to make movies with my little Super 8 movie camera that my mom gave me. So that's always been an interesting sort of question or idea in my head, is like, how do you adapt something that's essentially a literary work into these other media? But it's funny. I find that certain pop cultural or literary works for me have this sort of outsized influence or importance on my life in terms of how I see the world, and I find myself quoting certain characters from the books at different times, sort of as my mottos or as my sort of words of wisdom. I think about things that Gandalf would say, or I think about something that Yoda would say, or, I have these weirdly, because I've seen these movies and read these books for so many times, there's certain moments or scenes that I return to, in my head a lot. It's interesting. I think as I mentioned in my book, I discovered these things around the same time that my mom, suffered this really terrible traumatic brain injury. And as I talk about in my book, there's no coincidence that this was appealing to me at the time. And I think I've locked these two events, the sort of, tragic story of my mother, where that began, and my discovery of these fantasy worlds at the same time in my life. And they really are sort of fused in there in this really, inseparable way. So yeah, it's a really interesting, as I talk about in my book, I was not always fully engaged in this, and I kind of stepped away from it for many years. And then in my late 30s, early 40s, kind of got back into it again. And back when maybe it was a little less safe to talk about like your interest in fantasy or science fiction, that was publicly, amongst my cool friends, that felt like we were into independent music, we were into independent movies, we weren't into, nerdy pursuits. But all that's changed, in my view. And also I don't care anymore what people think about me, but that's also part of it. And maybe you've had that experience as well in your social circles, Julie, where there were times maybe in your life you felt more or less comfortable to share that stuff with people that you knew and cared about because of their potential, their reaction, or your own feelings of uncertainty about it.
Well, I think there's been a big change because I did literature at university, and I wanted to do. I did a third year thesis on Tolkien and Lewis, but it was very much regarded as taking a sort of, a strange bypath. Whereas now, looking at the next generation, my son is now studying English at university, and now Tolkien's on the syllabus. And there has been a shift in those decades, which I think is great because, obviously I think is great because when you look at all the great stories in the past, they're mostly fantasy anyway, just because they're called, I don't know, the Fairy Queen or the Tempest.
Right.
They're all fantasies. So there we are.
Yes.
I'm glad it's changed.
That's a good point. Yeah. So, I think that's an important shift, right? Because it in the end, it doesn't, obviously you and I agree about this, but there's no accepted, genre. It's still people and stories and emotions and, stakes and all the things that we love, and good writing. Tolkien's challenging as a writer. I found him really hard as a teenager to read, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things I really appreciated about your book, there is your own hero's journey in it, talking about this very difficult relationship, tragic relationship that you had with your mother, but also with your younger self in a sense, as you look back at that boy. And I don't want to spoil too many of the big moments, but I particularly was moved by the last section in New Zealand where you go back to like visiting Lord of the Rings movie sites and thinking about the whole of what you'd gone through. But I would recommend people book I won't by paraphrasing. But you also, on that quest, on that journey, you go through all the different subcultures that were around at the time. And we're talking about the sort of 2000s, aren't we? Which is when you did the research for this book. And so let's start with people who do live action role playing of different forms. What did you think of that community once you were exposed to their way of doing it compared to your own Dungeons and Dragons self as a teenager, which presumably you didn't wear costumes?
No. I mean, I think it's interesting because, of course, most kids do dress up, make-believe stuff when they're little, but that at a certain point, that's typically, you put those costumes away, except at Halloween time, right? And absolutely, what's interesting about LARPing or live-action role-playing LARPing is that the theater of it, or the sort of storytelling, happens in real time and in costume, and I think, as I talk about in that chapter of the book, it's, for me, felt like an additional level of immersiveness and commitment to this fantasy experience that I, at the time felt very ambivalent about. I was like, okay, I played D&D, but am I going to really dress up in a costume and run around in the woods with a foam rubber weapon, and beat people over the head with it? But I really admire those groups, and I haven't done much with that since then. Although, every so often you see groups around, or you hear of events that are happening in different locations. It's a really, I think if I had heard about it as a teenager and I was sort of introduced to it as a kid, because I was also becoming a bit of a theater person as well in high school, I would have totally gone for it. But it just wasn't something that we'd heard about, or, it hadn't reached its, aside from the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is also slightly different version of live action role playing. It's obviously has roots in a different sort of thread of all this. But yeah, it's like a lot of these subcultures. I think the folks involved in it are so both ordinary people and also just extraordinary in their ability to sort of do this. And this is like for some of them, like their life, or at least certainly every weekend or many weekends out of the year, they're going off somewhere, to a camp or somewhere in the woods or a college campus or something to do these. Like any committed, person with a passion or a hobby, it's their weekend life, for a portion of the year.
Yeah, we shouldn't really it's not that different from surfing or
no, not at all,
or drone flying. Lots of people have really absorbing hobbies. I think that what's interesting I found in your descriptions of the LARPing community is you've got those who do a very fantasy based version of this. What I'm more familiar with over here in the UK is people who do the historical reenactments. Great friend of mine liked to go and spend her time in, I think it was a Iron Age or early tech community, and met her husband there. So she was really interested in the craft aspect of it, the weaving and the baking and that kind of thing. So it's the stripping away and going back to a very basic form of life for a weekend or a couple of weeks. Which I'm sure is part of the attraction to the fantasy-based ones as well, because there's lots of skills involved in that.
Yes.
But you've got this other element of a fantasy creature who isn't you on top of it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because in the United States in particular, there's a huge interest in Civil War history and Revolutionary War history, where there's lots of groups that do these reenactments as well. They reenact battles, or they just go to these camps and hang out. Sometimes it's educational, or it's connected to some kind of historical site where, there's sort of people in costume, but it would never be considered fantasy, And I think that's interesting, is that community, from what little I know of it, is it's definitely a hobby, it's a passion, but it's not considered in the same category as LARPing, and yet they share some commonalities. They're not necessarily playing characters or advancing a story, but they are. You're right. It's all about, maybe for them, like it would be for me. Wouldn't it be great to live in a time when you had to cook your food over a fire and shoot your food with a musket, and the fantasy of living in a simpler time? And I think that's always a huge appeal of all this stuff, as you said. But then layer it with, but what if there were goblins and giants and wizards, and this larger story, and as a actor in this story, I could have agency in being heroic, or changing the plot in some way, or changing the fate of my group of people, my comrades.
I think you also have to be able to push your imagination a bit further, because the people living in Iron Age villages were pretty much like us. Whereas if you say I'm an elf,
right?
Yes, I'm not a convincing elf. I'm not tall and slender, and my ears aren't pointy. So I'd have to really, like an actor assuming a role, I would have to really buy into that. And I think that's what that community has. It's like an actor who doesn't break character, a sort of Daniel Day-Lewis version,
right? Yes,
of this, which I think is admirable. I'm not sure in your book you find I felt very much on your side with your sort of moments of, oh, what am I doing here? And what's my character?
Yeah.
And is my costume really rubbish? It was very relatable.
Yeah. A good for me as the writer, as the sort of, protagonist of my own memoir, to play off of those insecurities that I have already. It's just transposing into another, it could have been me at the high school dance wondering, how am I dressed? Am I dancing any good? Me at the LARP, how am I dressed? Am I fighting any good? Same thing, but it's more risky. I mean, for me personally anyway, that kind of stuff is yet another level of immersion that maybe is for some people would be less risky or seem less sort of outlandish. For others would be something they would never do in a million years. Sort of like those dinner parties you might host for a friend, where everybody, like a murder mystery thing, you get these kits in the mail and everyone has to play a character for the night. I mean, that's sort of like probably most people's understanding of both a role-playing game and a kind of a LARP. I mean, that's sort of like what people's understanding of that might be. Or maybe Halloween trick-or-treat night, at least in the States, where you're not really playing a character, but there's permission to be someone else for a night and to sort of have fun with that.
Well, it's the old tradition of carnival, isn't it? Where, topsy-turvy. And I actually loved I wasn't aware of what a big community it is in the States. Thousands of people turning up for these camps on a regular basis, really checking out and relaxing in. And I think, I just love the idea that it exists. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
particularly the Society of Creative Anachronism, which is the one that's been around for such a long time. It's not exactly LARPing, but they have these camps where, as you said, thousands of people can be part of these events, and which maybe as someone from the old world is curious to you, whereas from Americans' perspective, the idea of pretending you're in the medieval age is such a fantasy, right? Because we didn't have that history here in the United States. You guys have that there, but I don't know if that plays into it at all.
I'm sure that exists here. I'm probably just ignorant.
Yeah, it does.
It does, what I mean? But I think the scale of it is bigger.
Yes,
in the States is my,
like America. The scale of everything is big in America, unfortunately. Yeah,
Ethan, there's so much to talk about, but moving on from LARPing, then we get into the world of video gaming, or whatever we call it these days.
Right.
Your book finishes in around 2007, 2008. It's that kind of time.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So that's what you're looking at, and of course the technology with the headsets and everything is moving on. But I think the absorption aspect is exactly the same, of young people, well, not just young people, spending more time online sometimes than in real life. IRL, is that the
IRL? Exactly, right, in real life.
Picking up the jargon here. So what is your feeling about that community? Because again, it's a community. Not only does it have its sort of virtual daily contact, but they too have conventions and get-togethers and the rest of it.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me about the explosion of that is, of course, people. I mean, cleverly, these companies have created games that you can play on your iPhone, games that you can play on your iPad, just on your regular computer. And then, of course, games that are really intended to be ideally played, on the best possible, machine. And people can, depending on one's time and one's resources and one's interest, find a kind of game that sort of appeals to whatever it is that you like to do, right? So it could be a puzzle-solving game like Tetris or Candy Crush, or something where you're just sort of wasting a few minutes on the subway or something on your way to work, or these ones where you are literally getting together in groups, playing with people you've never met on the internet, maybe playing with a group of people that you do know in real life, that you agree to play together as a group. And you can choose your flavor of what fantasy means to you, or what that virtual world means to you. If it's cowboys and Indians, if it's, the Wild West, if it's post-apocalyptic, if it's steampunk, if it's pirates, if it's, you name it. I mean, that's what's amazing to me about it, is that, of course, the more popular ones are, to my mind, maybe in some ways the ones that are a little less imaginative, in that the goal mainly is to run around and shoot and kill things. to my mind, that's not as interesting personally. I don't mean to judge people whose sort of main interest is sort of those going on these sort of adventures where the goal is essentially to rack up body kills and complete these little quests or these sort of missions. But I think that it satisfies a lot of the same urges that we all have about completing things and being part of a group experience for those games that you do play together, a way to socialize in a sort of a an activity people can do together and have a kind of common objective and a common language or a common experience, like watching a movie together. For me as a middle-aged person, that's not something that I'm curious or interested in spending a lot of my time doing. But I'm really fascinated by how that has, really captured the imaginations of so many people. And of course, I think, as I mentioned somewhat in my book too, the sort of success of that genre has so much to owe so much to Tolkien, owes so much to Dungeons and Dragons. Some of these early versions of these fantasy experiences that sort of laid the groundwork for the ability of these games to exist, right? Particularly ones where you're playing characters and you're going into worlds and advancing through levels. That sort of slightly more immersive narrative, long term, where you might play for weeks, months, to kind of get through this sort of experience.
So it's very clear that the people creating these games, the coders and the artists and the renderers and everybody are hugely creative.
Yes.
But as the consumer of it, compared to the person who's LARPing, sort of inventing their character with a certain amount of free will, if you allow me that term, but certainly let's call it free will, compared to the person doing it in a game which is within the confines of somebody else's vision. How creative do you think it is to play a game like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to be careful in how I answer, because I don't want to be perceived as sort of being judgmental or saying like this experience is a better experience, than this experience. In the end, it's entertainment, and like a lot of experiences that maybe don't intentionally empower people, these kinds of games can be very empowering to people, particularly younger people or people with maybe neurodivergent people or people who might need a place to park their brains for a while and decompress. I mean, those are all such great uses of those games. Also, just to have fun, to do something fun by yourself or, with your friends. But you're right in that a criticism that you could levy against these is that on the hierarchy of like most imaginative, most, sort of creative for the consumer or for the user to least, I mean, you might say that reading a book is somewhere in the middle. You might say making up your own story is the highest, being a writer or playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe being a participant in an existing world that a programmer, not a programmer, hundreds, thousands of coders have created this experience. It's still activating your imagination, and you certainly, I believe, go places in your mind or in your heart, as you play these games. But it's surely different than a different experience than making those choices yourself, or as we were discussing earlier, imagining what the world looks like in your head versus having it visualized for you. And that's sort of why one of the things I talk about in my TED Talk, about Dungeons and Dragons, why Dungeons and Dragons is good for you in real life is this idea that one of the beauties of that game, or also maybe in a way reading a book, is that all of that has to happen individually, privately. That's a very different experience. You're a reader of books, so you know what I'm talking about, and it doesn't have to be a fantasy book. It's just any book you read, or any story that you try to tell. You're surely activating, different parts of the brain than where you just looking at a book of pictures or watching a movie. As much as I love movies, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Lord of the Rings, and I've seen those movies a million times, and I love that experience as well of having it sort of created for me and being a sort of passive consumer of this existing narrative that someone else has done all the work for me. You know, they're bringing me along, guiding me by the hand through this experience. So yeah, it's to me that stuff is really fascinating to think about. To my mind, it's a lot about balance, and I wouldn't want to only play video games, and I wouldn't only want to read books. I'd want to be able to jump in and out of both.
I think it's also quite good to jettison from the version that you get from a film. And it's quite easy to do with Lord of the Rings in a way, because if you go back to the original text, you find that actually Frodo's in his 50s.
Right.
You know, and in fact, the relationships are more of a period piece, master. I mean, once you sort of you say, right, okay, I'm aware of the landscapes and the visions, but the book is different. You can hopefully strip away. It's not Elijah Wood who's your Frodo; it's your own Frodo.
Exactly.
But just going back to computer games,
sure.
I think that there is an exciting development in that people are now able to, like in the Minecraft world, actually go in and invent. It's as though there's an element where writers have an alphabet and musicians have a musical notes, that computer games are coming to the point where people can have the ability to code and create and build, which I think is great because that makes it even more creative. To be honest, I haven't, there's only so many hours in the day though, and it's not the place I've chosen to put my creativity, but I can see how for somebody else it might be. Yeah.
And I think that Minecraft is a great example of this. I mean, of course, you know, it's easy to put all the video games and to say, you know, video gaming is this sort of monolithic, you know, thing. And of course it isn't. It's diverse, and there's big games that get lots of attention, and some of them are, you know, sort of predictable, or, you know, sort of rely on predictable narrative tropes of, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the view is running around and sort of killing things, if you will, or, you know, defeating things. But Minecraft is such a great example of a game that isn't that. And it's in a way surprising how popular that is, because it doesn't rely on, you know, the typical game, you know, environment or kind of game design, which is about racking up, you know, points, and in the sense of, you know, killing things or whatever. And what games that are like that are also, you know, they have, for every big game that you would think would be, you know, sort of, you know, gets a lot of the attention. There's thousands of independent game makers, and, you know, there's a whole indie scene where there's all flavors of games that you can have that are very subtle or very lyrical or very story-based or very participatory in different ways, you know. And I'm not saying those are the ones that people are hearing about necessarily, but they exist in the same way that literature has the big heavy hitters, and then the ones that are more you know, independent driven, and gaming as well. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons like games is a similar thing happening there. Of course, D&D has really become prominent as the sort of brand that everybody's heard about, but there's hundreds of other games that are similar to it that cater to other people's needs or other people's desires, that other people's what they like to play in a game. And that's what's beautiful about, I think, what's happened because of the internet, because of YouTube, because of Kickstarter. You know, all this stuff is possible now. Smaller producers can create content that can find an audience. It may not be as popular as, you know, some of these big mega properties and IPs, but nonetheless, they can find, you know, they can match themselves up with a ready and willing audience.
Okay, so this is we've been very positive about all of these. Let's dig down and do some of the problems of it all. Which you don't duck in your book at all. So there's an element when I looked at what you were describing in all of these worlds of using stock characters. Now, there's nothing wrong with stock characters. They usually are behind well-developed literary characters somewhere in the background. Yes. But for example, looking at those which are given visual expression, you get wasp-waisted women with enormous breasts and guys with rippling biceps. And it seems to me as though there is an element of, I don't want to be myself, I want to be this impossible version, which was never actually open to anybody except perhaps Arnold Schwarzenegger. So do you think that there's a possibility of this living as somebody else when you're actually just an ordinary person, can it be dangerous? Can it put a fracture in the psyche, or is it actually a good place to go?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think it's something that, when people worry about the dangers of these things, whether it's used to be that people worried about the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons back in the 70s and 80s, it gotten this reputation of being dangerous in the same way that heavy metal music was dangerous, in the same way that comic books are dangerous. Everyone's worried about warping the minds of young people and giving them a distorted sense of reality or a sense of what the future is like. And you're right. I think that we identify with our heroes in a book, and at least the ones where those heroes are sort of positive, who have agency, who can do things. And I think it's a natural experience we have as readers or players of anything, a game or reading a book or watching a movie, where would I love to be Viggo Mortensen, in this fantasy life? Yes. Is he incredibly, attractive character, yet troubled? I mean, that's what's interesting. That's his maybe a good example of a very heroic, outwardly sort of, very attractive character or, character type, but who himself has got his issues. I think for me, those are always more interesting than the kind of cardboard cutout versions. From a purely physical perspective, I think there has been a lot of backlash about that, and whether it's the Marvel universe or some of these others, where the concern is that maybe only the heroes can be white or male, or can be these sort of exemplary specimens of the human body, or for that matter, issues around race and around inclusion, around sexual preference or, gender identity. I mean, these are things that the industry as a whole, I think, has struggled with a lot. In fact, there was something I was reading just recently that the most recent iteration of Superman is that I think it's either Superman or Superman's son is, one version of one of the comic book, plots is that he'd be bisexual. And, sort of how is that catering to sort of trends, or is that basically saying, no, we're basically saying that, times have changed, and that, readers have changed, and people's ways of identifying with characters have changed, and they're not as judgmental. These are good things, I'm personally more attracted to the characters that are more flawed or more nuanced, that they aren't just, as you said, the Arnold Schwarzenegger. I just recently rewatched the Conan movies from the 1980s because I was curious. It's been a long time since I've seen those, and thinking about the character, even in sort of a not particularly smartly made, fantasy swords and sorcery kind of movie. I mean, it is really all about just his physical prowess and his good looks and sort of how good he is in battle. There's not much else to that character. For some viewers, that might be absolutely great, and they can go there in their mind and really, really identify with that character. Is it dangerous? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think as a woman, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Does that feel like a gender landmine, where you see a female character who, is perceived in a certain way, or only certain types of Hollywood actresses get to be those characters?
Yeah, I think that the Marvel universe and DC, in fact, have had a problem. They haven't quite got through it yet, which is people like Black Widow and Wonder Woman are always, I mean, they're beautiful actresses. And the men too are beautiful in their own way. But you wouldn't want to swing to sort of the fetishization of the male in order to justify doing it to the female.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah.
So, for example, just the thing of saying, well, wouldn't you want to wear a more comfortable fighting outfit than these things?
Right.
It's just, they're just impractical. So,
yes, yeah.
I think that there's this is very much, we're just touching here and we can't possibly deal with it properly in the time, but there's a whole issue here about how we are defining gender and the pressures that girls and boys are put under to be a certain form of feminine and a certain form of masculine at the same time as there's a idea that you can redefine and reassess gender. And I wonder if by pushing gender to the poles so that you're some sort of airbrushed beauty at either end of this spectrum means that a lot of people are sort of, swimming around in the middle thinking, I don't know which one I am because I'm not that and I'm not that. No wonder everyone is confused. And I think going back to the hobbits, they're ordinary. Nobody says, oh gosh, Frodo, you're such a heartthrob. Well, he was a good looking guy, but in the book, definitely he's never mentioned what he looks like particularly, other than he's a bit overweight at one point.
Right.
So I think that it's important that people are not forced to feel that they have to achieve some artificial version of what a hero in their gender is, or from their race, or whatever it is. I would have thought that fantasy is a really good place to do this, though, because the whole LARPing community and other people would probably be totally down with people being androgynous and, being
very
blue
much so.
and that, So I would have thought that it's a good place to actually explore all these identity issues without committing yourself to one particular version.
Yeah, I think it has been. I mean, I think, the high fantasy stuff of, obviously, not to pick on Tolkien, but obviously certain gentlemen of a certain age and of a certain generation where these ideas probably weren't even, on his radar. But yet I think in some ironic way, you can identify as an elf. What is an elf in the real world? Well, maybe there's corollaries to being an elf. What is a dwarf? They have their own identities which are different from human, and maybe that's partly why a lot of I think you could make an argument that a lot of these fandom communities, particularly around in the 1960s and 70s, where I think people attracted to role-playing games or people attracted to LARPing or the Society for Creative Anachronism or showing up in a costume at a science fiction convention, and even early on in the Star Trek convention or something in the 1960s or 70s. I mean, those were accepting communities, people who already felt
exactly,
on the fringes. And so the idea that someone would show up painted, green from head to toe, or was a male cross-dressing as a woman, or whatever that would be. I mean, that's an environment where, on the whole, I think those communities are quite accepting of people who don't fit into those traditional categories. Now, of course, there's always misogyny and sexism and racism and judgment, in any community. And I'm not saying that it was always easy for those people, but I think that there's a way in which you could argue that those kinds of communities, or those people's exposure to the different kinds of fantasy worlds, made it easier to maybe imagine that, in my day-to-day 9-to-5 life, I don't need to identify as a human or a male or a woman. I can find these other, versions of myself. And to me, that feels freeing. And it feels, again, I don't know, I have no sense of sociologically whether there's any basis for my little theory here, but it seems as if, versus, let's say, in your country, people going to see football. In my country, people going to see a football game, American football, like you have these sort of stereotypes of like certain kinds of people where conformity is really part of the, the experience of like attending a sporting event, or, being a sports fan, or, certain groups of people that we have anyway stereotypes in our head of like not being particularly open to the idea of people not fitting into predictable roles. Is that because, as a whole, those people aren't reading, fantasy or science fiction, or weren't exposed to this stuff as a kid? I don't know, but it does strike me as maybe people who might be more artistic or more creative or more inclined to be, interested in these worlds through whatever way, as a maker, as a consumer. I mean, those are probably people who are, on the whole, maybe a little more tolerant. I mean, or a little bit more open to the idea that it's okay. You don't have to fit into this, this slot. There's room for you to find your own place. And to its credit, I think a game like Dungeons and Dragons, which is, as you probably observed, is, I don't know what you know about it from pop culture, but from my perspective, it's this incredibly hot property, and a lot more people are playing the game now than ever before. And it does seem like the game has very cleverly addressed that issue by making it building into the rules that this is a community that is welcoming.
Mm.
You don't have to be just a guy. You know, it was never true that only men played, but
No.
certainly a majority of men only played, and now it's open, or at least they're branding themselves as being open to all players, all kinds of players. They're encouraging the character you play to be, you know, have different gender identities and sexual preferences, and tricky questions around race, you know, are being addressed, which I think is really great as well. You know, the orcs and the goblins were always evil, and they were always dark-skinned, and the sort of good people, you know, were always sort of, you know, fair and white, and, you know, that's a trope that we don't need, you know, with some exceptions. That's a trope that we don't need to.
I think Peter Jackson tried
continue.
to turn that round by making his chief orc bad guy, and the Hobbit was clearly sort of pallid.
Right,
you know.
exactly.
So
yeah.
you can do it just by hair and makeup, off you go.
Exactly, yeah. And yet this stuff is, you know, these works are so popular that they have a certain cultural, you know, currency out there. I think that it's hard sometimes to people to just realize how unconscious we are all, you know, biased in this way. We may just assume that the you know, the orc or the goblin is, you know, has bad intentions, or, you know, is bad.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because they live underground, and if you think of all those sort of blind fish in underground caves in Namibia, you know, they're all like white, looking creatures. So yeah, you know, just depends what your reference points are.
Exactly.
Ethan, just towards coming to the end now, I was wondering, since you've written the book, have you noticed any changes in the fantasy communities, or any directions which have been particularly intriguing to you? And what are you spending your time playing now? Because you leave us a bit of a cliffhanger at the end of the book as to what you're going to do with your fantasy self.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely one aspect of the book that I would revise. You know, were there to be an additional appendix or something, because, and this is partly the particular place at time in which I had to stop writing the book in order to get it finished. But yes, I mean, I think the book ends with a little more ambivalence about my experience. And, you know, the short answer to the question is I do play D&D pretty regularly with a group of guys who are similar to me, a bunch of writers in our 50s. And mostly, unfortunately, our group is men, not intentionally. It's just kind of the way it's worked out. But we play fairly regularly. Well, I should say we endeavor to play regularly, but we do sort of have, you know, a monthly-ish meeting or so. It's been a challenge with COVID, but we've actually been playing online at different times as well, which is another benefit of which is, I would say, I would add to your second question is like, or the first question. You know, the internet has made it actually easier for people to connect, and I think that's really explained a lot of the popularity of some of this stuff. Different versions of D&D and other kinds of role-playing games. There's lots of online platforms that are facilitating this, and I think that's been a great boon. So that's something that's really, I've noticed since I've written the book, that's changed. People are seeing D&D and other old-fashioned, you know, previously dangerous, now incredibly useful tools for teaching kids socialization and problem solving. That was not a brand or a sort of thing that you would say about D&D, you know, certainly back in my years. So that's been a really pleasant, and I would say, you know, important twist of the story is that D&D is fully accepted. And, you know, I think the other thing that I think, and this is just an observation that I didn't talk about much in the book because it was just beginning, was, of course, what's happened with the average Americans, or I would say the average citizen who watches movies and TV, is that there's so many versions now, more so than ever, of just some kind of fantasy, science fictional, comic book, you know, narrative experience that is just out there. And, you know, Game of Thrones certainly had a lot to do with that. Harry Potter had a lot to do with feeding maybe a generation of people who would go on to watch a slightly more adult version of fantasy in Game of Thrones and its ilk. I mean, I'm sure, you know, you have your favorite shows as well, but to me, it's amazing to think that people who wouldn't have normally accepted these kinds of entertainments as, you know, worthy of their attention. It just feels like everybody I know is, even if they're not fantasy or science fiction nerds. They have a casual interest in this stuff because the production and the storytelling is so good, and the tropes are so understood now and so recognized. Everybody knows these worlds, even if they're not, a super nerd like me or you. They have this passing knowledge, right, of what happens in these worlds, which I think 10 years ago, people were still just getting to know. So I think, the groundwork that, intentionally or not, the groundwork that Harry Potter, the movies and the books, Lord of the Rings, the movies and the books, some of these video games, the groundwork which they did to lay the foundation for a general understanding of, like, these worlds aren't scary and they're not places where you have to have like a secret past to get into. They're just these different narrative experiences with people in funny costumes and pointy ears. That's okay. To me, that's really, I'm just amazed as someone who felt like only me and my 6 friends knew about this stuff, back in the 1970s, to think that this is something that everybody shares. I don't know if that's something you observe casually in your intersection with these fandom communities and literature and movies, but
well, I kind of took a different route in that I became like a writer. I became my own fantasy worlds, and it's actually coming back to work out where I got it from that took me back into sort of exploring this again and starting up the center. So a similar, in a way, you did your journey back to see why you became interested in this material. For me, it was a literary quest to work out who was there at the beginning, and it was definitely Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, of course, because before I read Lord of the Rings, I was reading Narnia, and that had a massive. The going through the wardrobe is just the moment a lot of us experience when we open a book or start playing a game. We go through some kind of mental wardrobe.
Yes.
So to finish up, we always end our podcast with deciding where, in whatever fantasy world you would like to put forward, it could be a book or a game or a TV or movie, where in the world is the best to be or best to go? And in your honor, as you've used this on your book, where is the best fantasy world to be a geek, do you think? Where do they have the best time?
That's a good question.
You can offer where they have the worst time if you want. I mean, because there is quite a few of those as well.
That's a good question. I mean, I think the answer that immediately comes to mind is only because I personally would love to visit this place is of course Middle Earth, or even just a corner of Middle Earth. Maybe a corner that, for me personally, just I have this great affinity for the Shire and the places that appeal. Part of what those books do for me is like allow my sort of agrarian sort of Luddite version of myself to sort of linger. I could be a gardener and I could be happy being outdoors all day and smoking my pipe and drinking good ale.
Ethan, I think you're correct. I think we could actually redefine Bilbo as the geek of the Shire, because he's into all this abstruse elven lore and speaking Elvish, when all the other hobbits are looking at him and saying, "Oh, there's something a bit funny about Mr. Bilbo."
That's a good point. So he's spending all of his time, poring over his maps, and he is the geek, and is the outcast in a funny way. And he becomes the outcast. He becomes the outcast because he goes on this adventure, right, outside of his community, and comes back. That makes him the other.
He infects both Frodo and Sam with his geekiness.
Right.
They're both able to quote songs and. Gets him into a lot of trouble. For me, I would. That's a better answer than what I'm coming up with. But I was thinking that actually, there's a lot of really good geek roles in the Marvel universe.
For sure, that's a good point.
You can be a very bad geek in that universe, in that you become the uber villain. But there's also, lots of places you can work for Tony Stark in his nicer version of Tony Stark, perhaps, rather than the weapons making one. You can be the Hulk.
Exactly.
And there's all sorts of geeky roles in that universe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it depends. I think a lot of it has to do with how you define what a geek is and what kind of geek, because they come in so many different so many different flavors these days. Maybe it's for me, it's the place where I feel most comfortable being that person, and maybe it's surrounded by like-minded people who get me or understand this.
But I think I'm going to throw back into the pot my Marvel Universe suggestion, and I'll come and join you at Bag End.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Read the manuscript.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about that. The sort of who in the Tolkien universe is the geek, who is the hero, who is the who is the kind of the Tony Stark, or who is the sort of computer nerd.
Well, this sounds definitely like a conversation to have. If I can lure you back to Oxford for a tour of the places which are like the Shire around here. There are plenty of villages which would come quite close to, and they don't end at the, just because the cameras aren't there, you can go in houses which are actually very much like hobbit holes.
Yes.
So, hundreds of year old cottages and things. So do come back, and I would love to. I would love to re-enchant Oxfordshire for you.
No, I may have painted it. I may not have had a good tour guide when I was visiting all those many years ago. And for me, what was so great was just being in the places where I knew Tolkien had trod, many years before. That in of itself was such a fan pilgrim like nerd moment, just to think about that.
So thank you very much for being with us.
It's welcome.
Been a delight and lovely talking to you.
Likewise, I really appreciate you inviting me. It was really great to meet you and get a chance to nerd out together.
Yeah, huge pleasure. And thank you everyone for listening. Good night.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers Podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.